Did you know that an art became an eye-opener during the 90s? Well, this guy right here compiled some of his selected Philippine cartoons political caricature with his only Filipino contributor, Alfred Roses. Before anything else, I am Godfrey Edem Petallar.
And I am Ramsil Butaya.
And we are your speakers for today's historical reading. The guy that I'm talking about is Alfred McCoy. He is an American historian and educator. He was born on 8th of June, year 1945 at Concord, Massachusetts, United States. He is a Fred Harvey Harrington Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he also served as Director of Center for Southeast Asian Studies. One of his specializations is a political history of the Philippines, in which majority of his works and research focuses on the Philippines. He also served as one of the investigators of one of the controversies of the late President Marcos Sr. In 2012, he received an award, the Wilbur Cross Medal, which is presented annually to a small number of outstanding alumni and to recognize distinguished achievements in scholarship, teaching, academic administration, and public service. And he also received a Hilldale Award for Arts and Humanities that was given by the University of Wisconsin-Madison. 3 of his edited volumes in the Philippine historiography have won Philippine National Book Award. In 2021, the Association of Asian Studies awarded him the Goodman Prize for a deep and enduring impact on Philippine historical studies.
Along with McCoy is Alfredo Roses. Roses is a widely known journalist in Manila Times, an artist-writer from the unknown Roses clan and Philippine print media. He co-authored the political caricature of American Era. McCoy is the man behind the book Philippine Cartoon Political Caricature of the American Era. His book earned 2 awards from Philippine Catholic Mass Media Award as Best Book of the Year for 1985 and Philippine National Book Award for History in 1986.
Political cartoons or caricature is basically an art genre that implies an imitation of a person in which certain striking characteristics are exaggerated in order to create a comic or grotesque effect. It became part of print media as a form of social and political commentary. Cartoons became an effective publicizing tool through heavy use of symbolism, which targets persons of power and or authority such as politicians. The unique way that the political cartoons and caricatures represents an opinion that captures an audience's attention to create imagination of certain illustrations are enough reason for historians to examine its existence.
During the American era, Philippine political cartoonists gained its full expression. Filipino artists recorded national attitude towards the coming of the Americans, as well as the changing mores and times. A revolutionary expression against the Americans was expressed often through art, such as cartooning and illustration. For example, during the Spanish colonization, Dr. Jose Rizal wrote a literary piece which inspired Philippine Revolution compared to the American colonization. Many Filipino cartoonists expressed revolution through printed cartoon as a political caricature that is publicized through newspapers, which usually seen in editorial page. At that time, Filipino cartoonists uses cartoons in a satire way, which means to mimic a certain personality as a form of an insult that depicts societal issues, most especially those people in power. Political caricature should only be made in a basis of truth, since it is a societal eye-opener.
There are 377 cartoons compiled in the book, Philippine Political Caricature in Alfred McCoy's Philippine Cartoons Political Caricature of the American Era. The historian Alfred McCoy have done extensive research in Philippine and American archives, in which provided a comprehensive background research of the status of the environment during the period, and not only to the cartoons but to the turbulent period as well.
Figure number 1. An illustration entitled, "A Public Post is Not Hereditary Crown." On May 20, 1916, The Independent published the first instance. The cartoon depicts Dr. Santos, a politician from Tondo, handing over the throne to his brother-in-law, Dr. Barcelona. A Filipino man dressed in salakot and barong Tagalog was attempting to stop Santos, telling him not to give the title to Barcelona because it is not his to begin with. It shows a political statement because The crown stands for the Philippines and should represent Filipino rights or sovereignty. During the Treaty of Paris, the Philippines was sold by the Spaniards to the Americans in amount of 20 million US dollars. The Filipino government, especially Emilio Aguinaldo, tried to express their views and opinions to prevent this from happening, but they did nothing, since there were no Filipino representatives before. Unfortunately, the crown or the sovereignty was handed to others. Americans inherited a colonization history from the Spaniards. The first cartoon also presented the truth of political dynasty, where the power is only enthroned within the bloodline of the person who has the power. Just like the first political caricature, it shows how the power is being passed from Spanish colonial to American colonial.
The second figure, entitled War Against Speculators on June 16, 1917, The Independent released a second example as well. Fernando Armursola drew this, and it was meant to be a satire on how the Manila police operated at that time. Unable to find something to eat, famished, this young Filipino boy snatched a tiny chicken. The kid was being chased after the policeman non-stop. The cop was being grabbed by a man carrying a salakot bearing the name Juan de la Cruz, who instructed him to stop pursuing small-time pickpockets and thieves and focus on the big criminals. He was pointing at a sizable warehouse that was filled with large quantities of milk, rice, and other supplies. The American occupation in the Philippines is also the beginning of modernization and industrialization. That is why, in some sense, I would agree that maybe Karl Marx is right that this was also the beginning of capitalism in which the upper class enjoy their economic prosperity. And on the flip side, the poor becomes poorer out of economic imbalances. And this was what happens to the second figure. It speaks inequality. It speaks the gap of the rich and the poor. And that is the truth during the American era. This caricature reminds us that we still have problems and economic failure up until now. That we don't really grow as one country because the rich are getting richer. Or to be fair, there is only a few that becomes rich, where the majority are even deprived of their own rights. There is no such thing as societal progress when we as a nation don't grow as one, when there is still little totoys and indays who cries out of hunger.
The third cartoon was a parody on the rare instances of colored cars on the city streets, when tragic collisions involving cabs and cars were already occurring far too frequently. The Philippine Free Press issued this commentary. Basically, the third caricature symbolizes the presence of automobiles in the coming of a new transport system introduced by the Americans. This is a good sign for urbanization. However, with a rapidly changing society, rapid industrialization and modernization, the problem that circulates at this time is the lack of the policies, rules, and laws when it comes to the lawful use of automobiles, where unregistered and unlicensed vehicles are freely roaming the streets of Manila, which causes road accidents.
A theater is shown in the fourth illustration. A blown-up police officer appeared at the screen admonishing couples about making out at the movie, while an older couple appeared amused. Two youngsters had frightened expressions. The Spaniards was taught as conservatism as they brought Christianity to the country, and it is part of the culture. However, when the Americans came, they taught Filipinos to be liberated, including sexual acts. Definitely, it speaks the two contradictory cultures in which we inherited from two different cultures, where it changes from being too conservative to loosely liberated, and it caused confusions to many Filipinos in different generations at that time. They will see how Filipinos are trying to become just like Americans.
The fifth figure, entitled Uncle Sam Riding a Chariot. On November 27, 1915, The Independent released the next cartoon. Here, Uncle Sam is depicted as a caricature being pushed by Filipinos who are dressed in uniform. Baseball bats, liqueurs, and boxing gloves were among the American items the Filipino youths were transporting. According to McCoy's caption for the aforementioned comic, the cartoon was inspired by the 1907 incident in which William Howard Taft was transported to the Manila Pier on a chariot drawn by Liceo de Manila students. Such were denounced at the time by nationalists.
On August 24, 1907, Lipang Kalabaw released the final cartoon. Uncle Sam is shown in the photo dispensing porridge to politicians and Progresista Party members, formerly known as Federalista Party, while Nacionalista Party members watch and wait their turn. This cartoon shows politicians from any party vying for the favor of the United States. It shows what kind of society and politics the Philippines has under the American colonization. This is where we see that the early Filipinos did not really understand the true meaning and the essence of democracy, where many political parties are in harsh competition composed by elitists, power versus power, division of politics. The real essence of democracy is lost because it's supposed to unite people, but the lack of understanding about democracy hindered the society to prosper, and up until now, we are still experiencing political division. The transition from the Spanish colonial period to the American occupation period showed various threads of changes and transformations in politics, society, and culture. The Americans forcefully imposed democracy on the young country, and the results were far from ideal. In addition to this, it was also during the American era that Filipinos were first exposed to other modernizations such as healthcare, modern transportation, and media. A more accessible and liberated press resulted from this. Filipinos from various social classes had diverse perspectives on the post-independence and post-Filipino-American periods in their country. With the opening of the Philippine economy to the United States, the upper Principalio class enjoyed economic prosperity, while the bulk of poor Filipinos continued to be poor, desperate, and targets of state repression. The chosen cartoons present a comprehensive view of American-era politics and society in addition to the viewpoints of specific media outlets regarding Philippine society at that time. For instance, in the political sphere, we may observe that the Filipinos paid for the American-style democracy. First, it appeared that the politicians in the Philippines at that time did not comprehend the fundamentals of democracy and associated institutions and processes sufficiently. The Independence cartoon depicts the emergence of dynastic politics in Tondo is an example of this. Between clients and patrons as well as between the newly formed political parties made up the elite in the United States. Patronage also gained influence and power. This was portrayed in the cartoon where Uncle Sam, who stood in for the United States, distributed handouts to Federalista politicians while Nacionalista politicians watched and waited for their turn. As a result, the purpose of having rival political parties was to drive voters to make decisions. Politicians still have the problem of switching parties based on which one was in power at a given time, and it still exists up to this day.
The cartoons also show the difficulties of the transition from a Catholic-centered Spanish-Filipino society to an Imperial American assimilated one. The enormous rise in the number of motorized vehicles in the city is one instance. When cars became a common form of urban transportation, taxis started to appear. However, the laws and policies were poorly implemented. Due to this, there are now more colorful and illegal cars moving people across the city. The regulations controlling the issuing of driver's licenses were lax, and the traffic police were unconcerned by the frequent transgressions of the law. This is a direct result of the Philippine society's rapid urbanization. The 1930s sexual revolution, as McCoy referred to it, it is another such indulging in risky sexual behavior in public places, like theaters, caused young people to challenge the traditional Filipino attitude even back then. This demonstrates how the Philippine conservative past and Fred future met during that times. The cartoons also depicted the poor Filipino circumstances in the Philippines, which are now administered by the United States. Nothing much appeared to have changed, at least not visually. For instance, a cartoon showed cops brutalizing attractive Filipino criminals who are ignoring hoarders who dominate commodities in their big warehouse, presumably Chinese merchants. The other cartoons illustrates how Americans use seemingly innocuous American products to control Filipinos. Americans were able to control and subjugate Filipinos by influencing their mind and attitude.